when PM stands up and goes on about why it is that the social contract is a construct in which taxes are essentially a violent taking away of your rights, and that ultimately people should be able to move into whichever country they want based on that, and you should provide them with the ability to do that. When I question him on the idea of permanence and why it is you cannot opt back into that, he fumbles on his response. He tells us that actually you can move on to other countries, you can move on to other areas, but not necessarily back to the one which you came from. That is problematic on a number of levels, because it means you're creating, or states have an incentive to create, even if they're liberal, they might still be run by Theresa May, they might have an incentive to not want you or your particular group of people within that country, or create incentives for you to not be around within that. And we think that's incredibly problematic on a number of levels. I'll be looking firstly about why we don't think this is consistent with the responsibility of liberal states, looking in a couple of things. Firstly, looking at the principle of funds allocation and why it's problematic, by looking at who's going to opt into this and why it's not a particularly free choice and why that's an issue. And secondly, looking at what the impact on that is, first in terms of the people who choose to stay, and secondly in terms of the people who decide to leave and why that's not okay. So let's look, before that, at a couple of points of rebuttal. Because we hear all of this stuff about how taxes are essentially armed robbery, it's all of the work of a construct, and we just say, like, look, live in the real world, right? Ultimately, if we lived in a state of nature, then maybe these people would probably not be born. The chance of like mortality and infant rate would probably be quite high. Like, unfortunately, we need to live in a world where there's some order we don't live in a state of nature. Fine. But we specifically asked them, why permanence, right? Why is it that you cannot go back to the place in which you come from? This is something which is key that we'll be looking at later on. On that here, no thank you. Actually, most of this stuff fits into my substantive, so we'll look at it just now. Let's look at the principle of funds allocation. Because we think it is wrong to contribute people who the state has given to, who are not going to provide back necessarily in the future. We recognise that the state has given them all of these things like education, like the police, like security, all of these things in general, and then to fund them to permanently leave with no ability to come back is something the state should not be encouraging or incentivising. We think that people should always have the option of coming back to their communities or their homeland, and that should be something which is open to them. But we recognise that this is problematic on a number of deeper levels. Firstly, like, who is going to do this? So you recognise that, one, this might fund people who don't necessarily need the legal or financial ability to do so, which is a waste of money. But the more problematic one that this comes to is the larger amount of people who are actually going to be impacted or affected by this is people who don't have the funds. We think it's perniciously bad on a number of levels. Firstly, because, like, why are they going to do this, right? Why are they going to leave? And it's probably because the state isn't providing the conditions for a fulfilling life for them. The sufficient conditions where they aren't able to get jobs, or they aren't getting sufficient welfare in order to have a meaningful life. And therefore, what the state is now providing them the ability to do is say, well, if we're not providing these things to you, you have an option, you have an exit, we can get you out. Except the condition that is attached to them, as opposed to attached to people who have the money or funds to do this without relying on the state, is the condition of permanence. And we think that's particularly problematic, because it means that you're saying you create an incentive for the state to go, it might be liberal, but it can still be horrible to people. It can still be shit to the poorest or to the most vulnerable, right? The UK is a horrible place to a lot of minorities or people who are quite poor. Like, they can still say, yeah, well, we'll just lower benefits. We can lower these different things. They can just make it a living hell for these groups to live within these countries, meaning that they feel that this is the best way that they can go out there and try and do that. But the key is that they cannot come back to these particular issues. We think that that buys into a lot of the stuff that we get from opening government when we're talking about France and the burqa ban, right? They can just jump to the UK. Or they can, like, these, I mean, it depends if they include France as a liberal state, right? But France can just make it a lot more intolerable for Muslims to live within these particular communities or countries and say, well, look, you have the option, you have that choice. You have the ability to do that. But whereas because they tend to come from communities where they don't have the financial ability to do the moving to other countries by themselves, there is now this incentive for them to make it more intolerable for these communities to live, as opposed to restructuring society or restructuring how they operate with minorities or people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to try and make life more tolerable for them. They have the ability to get rid of them and move them permanently to a different country, to a different place, if they so choose to do, which puts pressure on them. If not necessarily from the state, right, and something we'll go into in a second, but from other groups of society, for example, the Daily Mail or Fox News, to add heaps of pressures to push these people out, to make the country feel like it's not worth them living in. I'll take closing.
The EU already today allow people to move and to stay even permanently at another country in the EU. Do you oppose that?
Well, it's led to Brexit, so yeah, potentially. Like, I mean, like one of the problems, right, is that they can move back. Though we're talking about the issue of permanence, which you seem to be ignoring. If someone moves from Slovakia to Slovenia, they can do so, but they can also jump back. Someone can move from Poland currently to the UK and then go home. The problem is, though, what you've got the incentive to do is, in opening government's world, have someone from France who feels pressurised because the government or the local community is keeping pressure upon them to not wear their burqas in public, which means that they feel that they have to go to the UK, except now they cannot go back to France, right? That is what you are doing, and that's what the real problem is. So this is not a debate about the EU or why it's analogous. So let's look at the impact on them, because it means that there is not an incentive to try and restructure society to try and protect these particular more vulnerable groups, because you have the option of them go. Why is it problematic in that level? I think it's particularly problematic to those who choose to stay who are from those communities. It means that when it is you have the Daily Mail rallying against these particular groups, or you've got that, was it Le Monde in France, who's having a go at people who are wearing burqas, and they're saying, well, why are you staying here? You had the option to go, you could have opted out, we were giving you the wage gap, but you're still here. You turn them into the target, because instead of trying to help them with their particular situation, you are saying that they are decided to be a plague on your society and still be there as a burden, as opposed to taking that option and fucking off elsewhere. That's problematic, because it means you heap massive social pressure upon those people to make that decision to go, and you make their lives intolerable when it is that you have communities or everyone around you saying that you're a pariah, saying that you're there to fuck up the state, saying that you're not helping with the greater good of the general state because you're different and because you ought to have left. We also think it's problematic for those who choose to leave. Because it's not a free choice, right? When you've got all of these pressures behind you trying to push you out there in the way that opening governments seem to think the world's a peppered place where everyone lives away of all these different things. You've got now huge social pressure to do that and to go into society which you don't necessarily know a huge amount, you don't have a particular group there. But also it can be really traumatizing if it's permanent, right? What if, for example, your family, your mother at home gets sick? You can't come back to that. You can't change your mind because it's permanent. Because you cannot go back to that because you've been told that you should leave, that you ought to leave, you decided to leave, and you've made your decision, now you've done that, and you're done. It means that it's incredibly difficult to integrate into that new society because you're new to someone who's been pushed there by a different state and a burden on that state. It means you can never go back to try and deal with situations which might arise at home. It's just a shit show. Very happy to stand up.